Okay, so hi everyone. As I promised, don't want to drag this out too much past the time we said we'd get started. My name's Anastasia Lang. I'm the founder and CEO of Picasso Labs. I will readily confess that this is probably my first time hosting a webinar from home. So quite literally from my home to what I think is probably your home. Welcome, and thank you for finding a couple of minutes to join. A couple of housekeeping, as I mentioned, there's a Q&A on the side, so please feel free to ask any questions you have. Anything that's unclear, just write it in. I'll do my best to answer during the presentation. If not, there's a couple minutes at the end for Q&A. Also, as many, like many of you, I have my young child at home as well, so if you guys hear some background noise, she doesn't quite understand the concept of silence during a webinar, so apologies for that in advance. So, one of the reasons that we decided to host this webinar is because we were getting lots of questions from the brands and marketers we work with. And before we talk about some of the recent findings and the research that we've undertaken, to give you a little bit more clarity, we hope, in this very confusing time, we wanted to explain why we wanted to do this in the first place. So for those who don't know Picasso Labs, we've always been a very data-driven company. Data and analytics are at the heart of what we do. In fact, we've been accused of being too data-driven. And our focus on data really comes to the creative. We've always tried to be at the forefront of understanding as much data-backed information about the imagery and video that brands and marketers are using to communicate. The way we do that is by trying to dissect and get as much information out of a creative to understand what are all the different visual cues and elements that you're using, and we combine that with performance data to help highlight trends. We do that as a company built by marketers for marketers. We do that for three reasons: brand governance, how do we ensure that all your communication is on brand? How do we ensure that every media dollar is going towards creative that maximize your ROI? And how do we give you data that helps you understand how the creative decisions you're making are influencing performance? But as coronavirus came into its full swing, we were getting a lot of questions from marketers that we simply could not answer. Should I continue to advertise during this time? What are best practices for a creative? Should I focus on brand building or direct response? And we realized here that we simply did not have the answers to those questions or the data to answer those questions. So we turned to people who have been studying this for a lot longer than we have. And there's someone on my team who we call Mad Professor Mike, who's the academic and the researcher, who basically what he's done is go through hundreds of pieces of research, looking at an aggregate of thousands of data points, both from currently what's happening as well as past recessions, to try and dissect and understand what are themes for brands and marketers that can be used to make sense of what's happening, and maybe even offer a blueprint and a roadmap for how you might want to react. So I will warn you, there's a lot of data here. There's a data point on every slide, but we hope this is useful, and it in fact is almost like a literature review of all the meta-analysis we've done internally to ask some of the questions or answer some of the questions we couldn't answer necessarily using our own data. So with that in mind, you've probably been hearing a lot about Weiji. Weiji is the Chinese word for crisis, but actually the way most companies are translating this is incorrect. The translation being used by businesses today is that the word crisis is made up of danger and opportunity. And that's actually not quite right. It's not as bad as the time Britney Spears got a Chinese character tattooed that she thought meant mysterious, but that actually meant strange. But the actual translation of Weiji is a point at which things start to change, or a transition. And I actually think that's probably a more apt representation of what is happening today and the impact this will have on marketers and brands going forward. So as an acknowledgement of what's happening today, marketers are in a tough spot. And this, of course, is a relative statement, right? I understand in absolute terms, some of the problems we have at work are probably relatively small compared to what some other people are facing. That said, I think it's worth acknowledging that marketers are in a place right now where they have to do a lot more with a lot less. Resources have been cut, whether it's access to financial resources, access to creative talent, studio crews, etc., simply lack of time because we're having to balance so much more with so much less time. And in fact, 71% have felt a challenge in producing new creatives. At the same time, there's pressure to get the word out, get information out, show that you're there, you're listening, and you're responding. And 92% of marketers have risen to the challenge. They've actually pivoted and adjusted their creative strategy in a very short amount of time, with 46% saying that the changes they've made to their creative have been substantial. Most of the changes that marketers have made to their creative today have focused on a couple of things. One is pulling back on ads that feature prices or offers, providing information, so moving to a much more informative point of communication, whether it's explaining best practices for washing your hands or other tips and tricks for maintaining hygiene in your home, all the way to trying to imbue their content with more empathy to show that they're there, they understand, and they're listening. So as these changes are being made in real time, we thought about the fact that this is not the first time that marketers are having to react in a time of economic downturn and economic crisis. And a lot of what we leaned on was research that was done of all the different recessions that have hit in the 20th century, whether the Great Depression or even the 2008 financial crisis. And we combined this with research from today to look at what are some of the opportunities or shifts that are happening that might be interesting for you to keep in mind. So the first thing that we're seeing is a huge shift from offline to online behavior. Now, this of course makes sense. Most of us are stuck at home. We can't really go out. What's interesting here is not even the fact that consumers are spending more time online. We'll talk about that in a second, but that they're spending time online doing activities that marketers previously could not get them to do. And there is a pattern and a habit-forming behavior that's being created now that some research says will be difficult to displace even after we return to quote-unquote life as normal. The second trend that we see is a cost efficiency. So it's become a lot cheaper to advertise. There's still questions around should you be doing it? Are people paying attention? But what we're seeing across the board is that media costs and CPCs and CPMs are falling. And we'll talk about whether or not that's worth taking advantage of. And lastly, when we look at historical data from past recessions, we try to understand what did people do? How did they communicate? And the big trend here is that they invest a lot into brand building. Now, we'll talk about whether or not that's a good strategy and what the returns are from that strategy on both sales as well as market share. So with that in mind, looking at offline to online, if there's one thing you take away from this presentation, I want it to be this. If for no other reason, you have a fun fact to use the next time you go to a dinner party. So as you guys know, many media streaming services were starting to buckle under all the demand that was happening. And Pornhub is no different. They saw a 6% increase in daily traffic. Interestingly enough, one of their biggest peaks came between the hours of 9 a.m. and 4 p.m., prime in the middle of the workday. So I'll leave that with you. I'm not sure what some people and what some of our colleagues are doing. But nonetheless, all jokes aside, this was a time where increasingly we saw a huge demand on online streaming services. Disney subscriptions grew by 25 million, Netflix by 16 million in a matter of 3 months. Unprecedented consumer demand. But this is not just for sites where you're watching long form and even short form content. Online media and the kinds of places that you're typically using to reach your consumers are showing growth in demand and in web browsing. Facebook and Instagram, web browsing is up by 70%, while YouTube consumption is up by about 30% at the moment. Now, the question here obviously becomes, okay, great. Well, users are online, and yes, they may be in places where I'm used to delivering a message to them, but are they paying attention to messages, or are they there just to engage with friends? According to a company called Lumen, viewability is actually up at the moment, which means there's a greater chance of cutting through. Viewability is the likelihood that your ad will get noticed. Compared to the digital norm, viewability is up 11%. However, one of the things Lumen highlighted is that ad dwell time, or essentially the time that someone is likely to look at your ad, is down. If you dig into that data a little bit further, there's an important caveat here that shows the criticality of a relevant message. If we cut dwell time and look at the ads that focused on coronavirus or acknowledge the fact that it was happening in some capacity, those ads' dwell time significantly increased versus ads that essentially went about and said, it's business as usual, life is normal. At the same time, as I mentioned, e-commerce is booming. So for some sectors, that's to be expected, but overall e-commerce is up 36%. What we're seeing is that certain generational groups are much more likely to shop online and are turning to online shopping in droves. Millennials, followed by Gen Xers, high earners are more likely to move to e-commerce faster than folks who are lower earners. An interesting case study here is about alcohol. So alcohol consumption and alcohol purchases have traditionally happened offline, obviously through restaurants and bars, but also through supermarkets. Alcohol online sales are up 243%. Now, the big question here is, will this behavior sustain after we're allowed to leave the house again and after life returns to somewhat normal? There was a research published by KPMG over the weekend that actually asked consumers about this. And what they found, interestingly enough, is that consumers have said that by trying out purchasing things they haven't purchased before, over a third of them have planned to continue purchasing in that way. Essentially, they have broken the mold and have been able to try out something that marketers have been trying to get them to try for a very long time. And once they're over that threshold, habit-forming behavior starts to form. Now, this is not just about online. This is not, just about alcohol. This is the case for many different types of products that we see today. Pretty much everything from baby products, household goods, health and wellness, pet products, etc., are up when it comes to e-commerce. And when we look at how long marketers in those industries have been trying to get their audience to shift to e-commerce behavior, what we're seeing is that actually COVID is one of the leading digital transformation agents of the company. CEOs, CTOs, CIOs have been trying to increase e-commerce penetration, yet this phenomenon has led to a natural surge and natural willingness, if by nothing but sheer force, for consumers to try purchasing both everyday products as well as products that previously had habits of being purchased offline to finally try purchasing those in an online environment. And what they're finding is that there is a convenience factor, at least for about 33% of them, that they think will be hard to displace once they're allowed to go back to quote unquote business as usual. Now, even within this, a natural question that many of the marketers we work with are asking is it tone deaf to advertise right now? And will I be seen as, taking advantage of an opportunity? Of course, there's been research on this too. And the research says that only about 8% of consumers expect brands to stop advertising at the moment. However, what they want brands to talk about has changed a little bit. Fundamentally, they want brands to acknowledge that something is different. So 77% of consumers want to know how the brand is being helpful in the new everyday, again, providing information. They want to know the brand's reaction to what's happening, especially for products that could be directly helpful to this situation. And they want brands to offer a reassuring tone. They want optimism. We'll talk about this a little bit more when we talk about some of the ads that have the highest emotional cut-through during this time. For brands who are just starting their e-commerce journey or who are finding they're having to shift here very rapidly, we've looked at a couple examples from D2C brands or direct-to-consumer brands where e-commerce is sort of part of their founding story to see if there's anything they're doing that they could learn from. And there are 4 examples we wanted to highlight. The first one is a brand called Supply. Supply is a brand that sells razors and blades. And while the common sort of wisdom has been don't do anything with pricing or offers that's really not going to work right now, they did this in a way that was very clever. What they offered was for anyone who buys a razor, they will ship them a 1 year's worth supply of blades. But they didn't make this about price. They didn't make this about discounts. They made this about the fact that you will only have to get one delivery, and that's safer and more hygienic for you than getting a monthly shipment of blades. A company called Homesick made a point of stating that they were donating a portion of their profits to different organizations in their community as a result. Many brands have been doing this during coronavirus, and this is something that's been resonating as well. Another brand tried a risky strategy, a brand called Love Wellness, which does a combination of vitamins. So typically in an e-commerce environment, when you click on the ad, you get taken to a landing page where basically there's no way out, right? They want to minimize distraction and get you through the funnel. Love Wellness tried a different approach where when you got to the landing page after clicking on the ad, there was a letter from the founder and the team talking about the impact of coronavirus on them, as well as what they were doing as a company to weather the storm. And what they saw was that their return on advertising investment and their conversion actually went up because they really tried to articulate who they were as a brand during this time. And lastly, you've got a company called CrossNet. CrossNet feels exactly like the type of company who probably you would expect to really not do well in this situation. They sell a cross-shaped volleyball net that really is meant to be used outdoors unless maybe you have a really big house. And what they've done is, again, project a really bright future of what's to come. Now, they didn't make it seem like coronavirus didn't exist. They simply really emphasized what life would look like when we finally get to return to some of the things that we used to do. So with that in mind, there are a couple of implications for marketers. The first one is if you are experimenting in e-commerce or have been thinking about doing this, now is a really good time to scale some of those efforts. There's natural demand here, unlike any we've seen for a really long time, but more importantly, an appetite to abandon existing patterns to try new things. And that's a rare opportunity to take advantage of, or at least experiment, whether or not your product can be purchased online and in what capacity. Be ready to shift your media and where it's going as a result of the changing consumer behavior. Now, again, this doesn't mean advertising on Pornhub, but it does mean that being cognizant of the fact that people are gaming and much higher quantities. App usage is up tremendously. So places that may have been overlooked in the past may be a good place for media spending. And lastly, focus on your brand. And what we mean by that is now is not the time for reinvention. So what are those pillars that your brand has always stood for that you maybe haven't emphasized in the last couple of weeks, months, or years? Now is the time to reemphasize this is what you're all about and this is why you exist. So we know that consumers are spending more time online and even that they're more receptive to ads. But the question is a good time for you to advertise? Well, we see that advertising investment is likely to be reduced in 2020 overall by about 30 to 60%. That's pretty much the case across every type of platform and medium. In a recent survey, 50% of marketers said that they have cut their spending to zero simply so they could, quote, live to fight another day. And that's not uncommon. And if, in fairness, not everyone will have the luxury to keep going. However, what we're seeing is that it's more cost effective to grab online attention now. CPMs and CPCs have fallen and continue to fall across the board. And so it is a much cheaper time to be advertising right now. What you're seeing is this rare environment where you typically compete for impressions and fight painfully for every reduction in CPM and CPC, is that you have natural demand in terms of consumer eyeballs, but supply is rapidly dropping. So folks who can actually put good ads in front of them. Now, the question is, sure, it might be cheaper, but is it actually more effective? And this is where we look at historical research. So there's a group of researchers named Tellis and Tellis, and what they've done is analyze 40 different studies across 37 markets, looking at every recession in the 20th century, starting from the Great Depression all the way to the 1980 and 1991 recession. So one of the things that they measure is what happens based on your response to a recession. And really what they're looking at, did you cut spending or not after a recession, during and after a recession? And what they find is that the brands that do not cut spending during a recession and continue to actually grow and aggressively advertise had sales that were about 256% higher than those that didn't. This type of finding has been replicated over and over and over again. Perhaps this is based on, the basic laws of supply and demand, but over and over we see that brands that continue to stay involved do reap those benefits from a sales point of view. They also reap those benefits from a market share point of view, which is probably something that's even harder to shift. So looking at some other research around a recession, this group of researchers compared, what do you do? Do you decrease your ad spend? Do you increase it by 20%, or do you increase it by more than 20%? And they looked at what happened to your market share as a result. And what they saw was that marketers that increased their spending by an average of about 48% doubled their share gains during that time. And that, again, comes with a huge caveat that we do understand that this can be a luxury, but because of the natural laws of supply and demand, there is an opportunity there to grab attention and really forge those cognitive shortcuts with your brand at a time when prices are cheaper, that is much harder to replicate when the economy recovers. What happens if you go dark? So like those 50% of marketers who were surveyed who said they turned everything off. And there's, again, some research here that brand usage and brand image decline. The biggest thing is that any uplifts in consideration start to decline at about 15% a week. And if you stop your campaign entirely, in under 4 months, you're back to those brand consideration metrics that you were at 4 months before the campaign. So if increasing spend is not possible, investment is not possible, is it possible to at least maintain that spending so you maintain a competitive advantage relative to folks who may be investing more aggressively? Looking at a case study here, we look at the financial crisis of 2008. So Virgin Atlantic found itself in a position where its 25th anniversary happened to fall flat in the middle of the financial crisis. They had declining airline seat sales at the same time as oil prices were soaring. And yet they decided, we were going to launch a campaign called the Still Red Hot campaign to show that we were still there. That campaign focused on reach and penetration. The goal was to, again, build brand awareness and really connect with consumers across the board. In typical Virgin Atlantic style, again, it leaned on their quirkiness as a brand. This drove about 20% of their overall revenue. They found that year with a return of about 10.5 pounds for every pound invested, or about $12, I guess, for every dollar and a half invested. Now, the cherry on the cake for them was that while the airline industry was going through something not too dissimilar as what they're going through now, Virgin Atlantic actually posted a profit of $68 million, while its competitors like British Airways had losses of about $401 million. So in looking for research about what are some ways that you can be more economical with your advertising, we looked at some studies published by the Harvard Business Review. Now, keep in mind, these studies come in 2008. So I would introduce some caveats to some of the things they've recommended. But I think some of these are still worth mentioning. So the first thing they recommend is reducing creative length, taking your 30-second spots and turning them into 15-second spots. I would argue that you can upcycle and reuse that content even more cleverly today, turning it into 3-second and 5-second spots, given that tends to be the average view time of a Facebook or a YouTube video, respectively. There is also a big strategy around adapting and expanding, so making sense of upcycling essentially your existing content and reusing it. The great thing is that you can go through your library of content, find content that is on brand, find content that maybe doesn't emphasize, social interactions directly and things like that, and see if you can repurpose that content today. Thanks to computer vision technology, algorithms can troll through all that content based on the specifications that you have and find that things that meet that criteria very, very quickly, essentially pulling things out for you that meet the demands that you have. Even if you don't have that, you can eyeball this and see what you have in your library that you can reuse. In 2009, HBR made a recommendation to substitute what they called cheaper advertising methods for television spend. Now, I would argue that that's probably not the recommendation they would make today, mostly because if we look back at the fiscal crisis of 2008, really the winner of that crisis was digital advertising because of the accountability and measurement that it introduced to marketers who were able to shift their spend because they found that they were able to measure more. And that brings us to we're going to skip point 4 for a second and go to point 5, which is anything that is more measurable that allows you to be more targeted is probably a good thing because then you can get a more real-time response as to what's working and what's not. Going back to point 4, which is waiting for prices to fall, again, if you have the luxury of doing this, a big recommendation and learning that they had was avoid making any long-term media commitments. If prices continue to fall, you really want to structure media contracts for shorter timelines so that you can take advantage of any further price falls that happen. So we know that consumers are spending more time online. We know that it's cheaper to advertise and there are potentially some long-term gains to be made. The question is, what kind of advertising should we be doing? Again, here we turn to some historical research about what kind of brands recover fastest and do best during economic downturns. The first thing that we see is that, according to Miller Brown, the brands that are most successful really focus their ad dollars on brand building activities. And when they looked at those brands, they found that those brands had a couple of things in common. The first one is they really leaned on their distinctive brand assets or their key brand cues. This was not a time, again, for trying new things in that way. This was a time of leaning back to that legacy of what your brand was and emphasizing that. As those brands focused on maximizing reach across platforms, they tried their best to be incredibly consistent. So you weren't getting one message on digital, another message on television, and third message in print. Regardless of the platform, there was complete consistency in what the brand was saying and how they were saying it. And lastly, there is differentiation. And again, these concepts are all obviously quite interrelated, but the differentiation piece was really, again, going back to the core of what is the ethos of this brand, what is its reason for being, and how do I continue to reinforce that, we're a brand who's here for you, who's going to be helpful, who's going to offer content that just gives you tips for how to get through this, rather than trying to sell you a product. These are some of the commonalities they found. Now, in general, there's always a conversation about the general efficacy of brand building versus more conversion campaigns. And while this is not recession-specific research, we did think it was worth mentioning to say that brands that are high-strength brands, which is defined by some of the things we just talked about, tend to have a number of key advantages. They, command a price premium of 13% because the product is perceived to be of higher quality and higher, and therefore worth more, even if there's no difference other than the brand building activities that they're doing. Brands that tend to feature these distinctive brand assets or campaigns that include them had a 62% stronger short-term profit ROI, and that is attributed to the fact that these distinctive brand assets or these tools we use in brand building are very effective at forming cognitive shortcuts between you and the consumer, so the cut-through when seeing your ad happens much faster. And they had any 1 point improvement in brand consideration ultimately had about 0.5% to 1.5% uplift in sales. So that's general brand research. But again, we want to be specific to what's happening right now. So here we turn to some studies done by Kantar. Kantar has what they call their Brand Z index and methodology. The Brand Z is essentially looking at brands and combining their financial data as indicated by their stock market performance with their strength as a brand. So the first thing that Kantar found is that their top most powerful brands, the brands that had the highest, what they call meaningfulness, uniqueness, and salience, and these points are actually very similar to those distinctiveness and consistency points. They just use slightly different words. But those brands that had the highest brand strength, if you will, outperformed the S&P 500 by 128% during the last 13 years. These brands focused significantly more on brand building activities than some of their competitors. But what's really interesting is if you see that chart, and again, I know it's harder on a small screen, there is that dip in 2008 and 2009. If we zoom in on that dip, what we see is that strong brands, as defined by this methodology, recovered 9 times faster than the S&P 500 following the financial crisis. You can see they bounce back much more rapidly because they continue to invest in brand building activities and because those distinctive brand assets that they have are more forged in the consumer mindset. So with that in mind, turning back to present day, if you are investing in brand building or any advertising, what are some things that you should be doing? There's a wonderful researcher named Orlando Wood, based in London, who does a lot of research on television ads. So I will caveat that this is specifically related to TV. And one of the questions that he had was, first of all, because we are so emotionally drained right now, can we even respond to ad content in an emotional way? And the reason why he was asking that question is because emotion is perceived, the ability to draw emotion out of a consumer is perceived with the ability to forge a brand connection. And what he found is that our ability to give emotionally to ads has not changed at all. So in analyzing TV ad content every day during coronavirus, what he found is our emotional capacity hasn't suffered. But there are essentially do's and don'ts. The do's that he highlights are that ads that are using either brand characters or what he calls fluent devices or these distinctive brand assets tend to resonate more, probably because they already have a cognitive shortcut that is embedded, and they create an ability for the consumer to quickly recognize something familiar. Ads set in the past or playing on nostalgia did well. Ads that showed a human connection were very important and performed much better. And ads that had some connection to community and place that had a local relevance also performed well. The things that didn't perform well were things that were hard sells, any ads that showed things over people. So actually what they found is ads with no people at all tended to have the lowest emotional response during this time, perhaps because we are craving that human connection a little bit more right now, as well as ads that indulge vanity or were seen as being too competitive or aggressive, which probably came off as, again, slightly tone deaf during this time, perhaps based on the fact that we see this as a time of cooperation rather than competition. There's a question that came in whether this was based on US or UK. Orlando's research is specifically UK based. And by the way, we will send this out afterwards, and if you have any questions about the statistics or any of the sources, we quote them on here, but we're also happy to send you the link if you want the primary material as well. So, implications for marketers from all of this. If at all possible, reinforce your brand distinctiveness. Go back to those distinctive brand assets. If you don't have distinctive brand assets as a sort of a concept, it's anything that is a key brand cue that you think forges a memory shortcut. Go long, so invest in creatives that have reach and penetration in mind. This is, again, a good time to share and show a broader message about what your brand is doing and what your brand stands for, because you want that association to stay strong, again, acknowledging if you have the luxury and opportunity of doing that. And lastly, protect your brand. And what we mean by that is if you're experimenting with new initiatives like e-commerce, or if you work at a company that's a little bit more fragmented where, one team does display and another team does social and the third team does e-com, it's really important that you're aligned on what are the brand pillars you're going to emphasize together versus having one message, for your e-com campaign and a completely different brand proposition for some of your social campaigns, for example. In short, this in some ways is the ultimate reset button. And looking at past recessions, what is both, I think, a threat and potentially an opportunity is that 85% of market leaders actually get dislodged during a recession. Now, depending on the brands that you work on, this can be a scary thing or it can be a really, really exciting thing. But this is a time that, again, it's possible to make huge gains in market share simply because the rules have changed so dramatically under our feet. And while we of course want to proceed very sensitively and very cautiously, and we want to walk that line between being sensitive to what's happening, there is also an opportunity that I think a lot of brands and a lot of marketers fight for years, where there is now some ability to get ahead and make some of those market share gains. Like most of you guys, our company's been impacted as well. And I think the biggest thing that's changed for us is we essentially have to throw out our entire roadmap and all the things that we were developing. But based on feedback that we've gotten from marketers, there's 3 things we've prioritized that we've just released or are about to release that we hope will be helpful in this new environment. The first one is a deeper e-commerce integration, so the ability to determine what are the kinds of creative cues that work better in an e-com environment versus a brand environment. We've got an integration with Amazon coming up as well for folks that are more aggressively embracing media on the Amazon side. To help on the media efficiency side, we're launching something called alerts. We know every dollar and every pound is much more valuable now. So we have real-time notifications that will notify you or your media agency when even a single dollar is being spent on a creative that does not meet your brand guidelines, that is not set up for success, that is not optimal based on what you consider to be the right ad for the right platform at the right time. And lastly, just last week, we launched something called Brand Builder. As more and more of the brands we work with, we're talking about utilizing distinctive brand assets and brand cues. So this is a tool that actually enables you to measure your brand consistency and look at what is the investment that you're making into each distinctive brand asset that you have, and is it garnering impressions and volume with your consumers, so you've got a little bit more of a tool for tracking brand. Again, we know that what we can do in the grand scheme of things is very small, but we heard that the stuff we were working on was simply no longer relevant, so we tried to adjust and build things that were. So with that in mind, thank you again for finding a couple of minutes to spend with us. I hope this was helpful. Again, there's a lot of research that didn't make the cut, simply because, again, there is a stat on every slide, and we sometimes get told that's too much. We will send this out. If you have specific questions about any of the research, please let us know. We'll send you the primary materials, and we're happy to talk you through anything we found. But thank you again, and please let me know if you have any questions. So people ask for access to the presentation. Yes, we'll definitely send that. There's a question about have we seen the e-commerce shift within our client base? And the answer is yes, we have. We've seen a lot more people experimenting with e-commerce, but also trying to figure out what are the best practices that they can be doing on e-com that they weren't previously doing for their brand campaigns. For a lot of the brands that we work with, which are similar to the brands on the call right now, mostly Fortune 500 brands, a lot of offline sales and activity. This has been a real learning curve, so better tracking here has been really helpful. Please let me know if you have any other questions. And if not, my email is here, just my name at picassolabs.com. So please shoot us a note, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you have. And thank you for joining.